Gazela Pudar.
Actually, we agreed the French Institute director will go first, but yes, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm really pleased to be with all of you today. My name is Manuel Bouard and not Vesna, as you can read it. So I'm really pleased because it's important for us to be able to hold this type of event today. To start, and first of all, I would like to thank our partner. Our traditional partner, the Social Theory and Philosophy Institute, her director, Gazela Pudar. Also, Ivica Mladenovic, searcher in sociology, who is our traditional partner also. Rijeka University and L'École Normale Supérieure de Paris, without whom this conference won't have been held. So, as you may know, I would like to underline one thing. It's a priority for us for the two next years, 2021 and 2022, to develop our links between France and Serbia concerning social and human sciences. In these fields, we would like to develop cooperations, and that's why I'm really glad that this conference takes place today. It's really important for us, and I hope to be able to organize maybe physically some other debates like this one in the next few months at the French Institute and maybe at university in your different institutions in France or in Serbia and also in Croatia. So I will be short, and I will just wish you two strong days of debates around Pierre Bourdieu, and I wish you also a good Christmas and a good New Year. I hope wealthy in cooperation. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for generous cooperation during previous years. Also, I hope that our cooperation will continue. We have, as you can see, a few of the researchers who are very much connected to the France and French institutions. And I believe that they are really bringing some specific flavor to our institution here in Serbia. And we really appreciate your support here. I'm also very grateful to other partners. You mentioned them already: Center for Advanced Studies, Southeast Europe from University of Rijeka, and École Normale Supérieure, of course, one of the premium institutions in France. This is the specific occasion and really honor for the Institute to be host of this conference, which is honoring Pierre Bourdieu. 90 years from his birth, actually, and probably, as far as I know, at least Zona told me that is the only conference this year which is happening in this occasion. So we are quite happy to be co-host of the conference. I also want to thank to my colleagues, especially to Zona, Ivica, and Milan, who worked very hard to organize everything, who hoped also that it will be possible to organize this in person, in physical way in Belgrade, but unfortunately circumstances are as they are, and we all moved to Zoom, and I really look forward to the times where Zoom will not be the dominant way of communication, but so far here we are. We are quite happy, since I have to say that the Institute started its series of big conferences 7 years ago, almost, with Michel Foucault. That was the first one which we organized here at the Institute, which gathered more than 100 participants back then, and we were really proud because back then that was organized to celebrate the founding of the Group for Social Engagement Studies at the Institute. So this was really specific moment for us as a way in a way, this is also a very specific moment for us because we are organizing a conference which is memorizing Bourdieu, I would say the world's greatest sociologist of modern times, definitely the one who produced the last grand theory in sociology. And we are very happy that we are able to host you all today. And I also will not continue anymore. I hope that you will have a productive discussion. I hope I'm very much looking forward to the panels where you're going to discuss, or we are all going to discuss about Bourdieu and his public engagement, because this is my field. Actually, I am engaged with sociology of intellectuals, so I'm very much looking forward to this part. But of course, his work was so complex, rich, that I'm sure that everyone who is dealing with the social theory will find something for himself or herself during these 2 days. So thank you all, and enjoy in the fruitful discussion in the next few days.
Thank you, Gazela. Thank you to the both of you for this introduction. I would just like to add now the introduction for Marc Crépon and a few words about our conference. Indeed, the occasion is the 90th anniversary since the birth of the world's most cited sociologist, who was also, not to forget, a philosopher and who is an alumni of École Normale Supérieure. So like Gazela was saying, it's interesting because everyone can find something in Bourdieu's oeuvre, philosophers and sociologists, social scientists alike. And we started with Michel Foucault, the most cited in social sciences, and the second most cited is Bourdieu, and all in the line of our horizons of engagement, which is the most important thing collectively for our institute, that academic thought and research, it's not just something designated for the area of collegial debate for academics, but that it has actual real world implications. In this context, we also hope to animate lively debates that will have engaging discussions around the roles of intellectuals today, the context in which we read Bourdieu today, which is something Marc Crépon will tell us more about. And so just a few words to introduce what starts as a first collaboration between our two institutions, École Normale Supérieure and the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. Indeed, like Gazela was saying, there was one conference on this occasion of the anniversary at Columbia University. So maybe we are the only ones doing this with, in the old continent. And let's hope it will have a great echo. We plan it as well as a direction of works in next spring, hopefully, that will introduce in the Serbo-Croatian languages in the region more closely Bourdieu's work and legacy. So Marc Crépon is joining us today to open and give the Conférence Inaugural, inaugural conference. Marc Crépon is the former director of the philosophy department of the École Normale Supérieure and the author of more than 20 books, multiple articles, and mostly always engaged with the topics of violence, fear, democratic engagement, deconstructing certain identities based on social construct, and reminding us of those that are uniting versus those that are dividing. Last year, he was also our guest, luckily in present, in real life, not on Zoom, on the in Serbian. Last May, that it was translated into the Serbian language. And the conference was here, was at the French Institute. And hopefully we'll be able to have, like you were saying, very soon, in a few months, similar occasions. Marc Crépon's latest book is continuing his thoughts on violence in society and in general how it constructs and implements hierarchies of domination, which is obviously a direct connection to Pierre Bourdieu's work. And his last book, in particular, these questions in the context of violence against women or violence against children, in which cases taking a stance or talking about it is much harder. So just to give you a little bit of the current topics he's working on. But of course, Bourdieu is always close to heart in everything we do. And I will let him tell us more about what he thinks, why we all need to read Pierre Bourdieu today. Thank you, Marc.
Okay, thank you, Zona, and thank you, the Institute of Philosophy in Belgrade. I'm very happy to be part of this conference and to open it, and was part of all the movement that wanted this institute staying open in the best conditions, and I'm very happy to have the possibility today to speak with you. The title of my paper, as an introduction, is named On Consent to Misery. And we wanted to think of the elections that brought to power charismatic, populist, reactionary, sexist, and xenophobic leaders around the world as an accident of history, a fit of bad temper or an outbreak of fever. We wanted to believe that this was a moment of bewilderment of angry people, disappointed in politics, and that the first steps of these leaders in violating the principles and values of democracy would soon bring the voters back to reason. We wanted to imagine that in spite of everything, there exists a consensus on democratic values and principles, a consensus stronger than negative passions and constitutive of a shared heritage, a consensus which is sufficient to reconstitute, if not impose, a symbolic barrier against the questioning of its principles or their destruction. This consensus had certainly given way once, but we thought it to be deeply rooted in the spirit and democratic culture of men and women who were not prepared to give it up permanently. We were mistaking our desires for reality. In Europe, like in the United States, the infatuation of a large fringe of the electorate for the populist rhetoric of these vehement and often caricatural leaders, the very ones whose gestures, language, and violence offend the intellectual, cultivated, and comfortably installed elites, seems to be confirmed with each new election. The recent American presidential election almost gave us another confirmation. For months, a landslide victory for the Democratic candidate had been anticipated, which the same elites had been waiting for as a return to normality. This did not happen. Not only was the democratic success hard-won, but its very conditions, the suspicions of fraud and the contestation of the result confirmed the magnitude of people's distrust in the institutions, in the state administration, and in the media. The very image of the democratic process was weakened when the imperative to count every vote because the choice of each individual is equally important was no longer agreed upon. To refuse such a count in a helpless attempt to falsify Trump's victory meant not only turning one's back on that basic form of political decency, which is based on the acceptance of alternation, it meant most importantly turning a partisan and perverse invocation of democratic rules into the springboard for their destruction. It was then foreseeable that once the confidence that the democratic process requires in order to assure a peaceful transition was compromised, uncontrolled manifestations of violence ensued. The mistrust was not insignificant. It confirmed a gap. Suddenly, it reminded us of how fragile democratic reason is when confronted with the rage of negative passions that fracture society while at the same time distancing it from the principles that are supposed to ensure its unity and coherence. It attested to the reality of a country so fractured that over time, the two camps no longer speak the same language, becoming irreconcilable as words have lost their common meaning and nothing can be agreed upon. The words freedom, equality, democracy no longer convey as shared meaning, if they ever did. Paradoxically, it became possible to use these words to justify and endorse their historical antonyms: discrimination, inequality, injustice. This was not surprising. Language is a weapon that few governments and political leaders have the wisdom to use without creating disorder and confusion to capture the attention of voters, discrediting their opponents. With populism, however, a new threshold is crossed with the deliberate use of a vulgar language that does not shy away from provocation, choosing to cut itself off from the most elementary rules of democratic decency. The most sacred words of language, bearers of values that one would expect to be commonly shared, find themselves drowned, overused, diverted from their meaning, caught in the net of passions, and instrumentalized by a part of the elite to trick people into espousing causes that go to their own detriment. There is no doubt that hatred, resentment, envy, and revenge are at work in populist rhetoric. However, are we deluding ourselves again in thinking of the gap as an opposition between democratic reason and raging of passions? Are we not once again demonstrating bad faith and blindness by minimizing the vox populi, as the elites are always inclined to do when it disturbs their frames of thought and linguistic codes? Let us remark on three traits of impermeability which these negative political passions display throughout the world. First of all, they are impervious to the reminders of history against the disastrous effects of any renunciation of fundamental rights and freedoms. Secondly, they are impermeable to the commonly accepted condemnation of all political instrumentalization of differences and of their phobias, homophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and so on. Finally, they are impermeable to the sacred and uncompromisable character of fundamental principles, such as the separation of powers, the equality of rights, the right to asylum, academic freedom, and so on. However, one must be careful not to misinterpret this impermeability, which can be understood in two ways. The first is to put it down to ignorance and the weight of affects. It amounts to thinking that the political choices of voters seduced by the radicalism, if not extremism or even fanaticism of populist discourse, can no longer be corrected simply by virtue of the attachment to fundamental rights and freedoms. This somewhat arrogant view postulates that voters glued to the screens that capture their attention and their emotions prioritize the self-interested and partisan mimicry of their passions over any other consideration. What matters to such an electorate, so the argument goes, is not the truth and correctness of the analysis offered by the political leaders who demand their votes, nor their fidelity to the principles and values of democracy. What matters to such voters is the skill with which politicians declare themselves in union with voters' emotions, persuading them that they feel, live, and think things as they do, reaching out to their desires. This way of representing the vox populi, which is once called demophobia, consists of producing a pejorative image of the people in order to govern them without consent or consultation. Two features define demophobia. On the one hand, it institutes and systematizes the discrediting of any opinion that expresses mistrust, discontent, or even criticism of institutions, thereby denying any power to the people by performing a perverse reversal of the legitimacy of democratic suffrage. On the other hand, it establishes a hierarchy of opinions, differentiating between the informed, educated, and competent, and the captive and manipulated, or even idiosyncratic, instinctive, and impulsive. The second way of understanding impermeability discredits this Nietzschean and Platonic demophobia. It turns it on its head, switching subject and object. In this second interpretation of the problem of contemporary impermeability, it is no longer the electorate. In this second interpretation of the problem of contemporary impermeability, it is no longer the electorate seduced by the sirens of populism, which is impermeable to the voice of political reason. It is instead this very reason, embodied by those who claim to recognize themselves in its values and principles, which has become impermeable. Impermeable to what? This is the main question that I will try to address. I will follow Bourdieu's footsteps to show that if we are to speak of impermeability, it is with regard to the conditions of non-existence in which a considerable part of the population lives, without any form of social recognition. If there is a problem of contemporary impermeability or imperturbability, it is that of a political discourse that has lost touch with all the misery of the world. To quote the title of a book Bourdieu wrote in 1993, which should have alarmed us more while there was still time. This category, misery, refers to all those who, struggling to make ends meet, perceive themselves as the vanquished of history, accompanied by the permanent feeling that their sufferings are ignored and their claims never heard. Political reason to which they are asked to subscribe, keeping silent, letting others decide for them with passions and confidence, waiting for better days, no longer speaks to them as it is built upon their erasure. To use Foucault's term, political reason makes of their sufferings not only a mute remnant of politics, but even more violently turns them into the blind spot of political analysis and calculations, a collateral damage of economic development at a time of globalization, a fatality of history. This language no longer speaks to them because it has remained for too long impermeable to their needs and expectations. Second step. Bourdieu's reflections are therefore about misery and ignorance thereof. What we neither knew nor wanted to see, a fracture, if not a cut, which has for too long been assumed to be incidental and inconsequential. Confronted with the success of populism, with its verbal and physical violence, with racism, sexism, chauvinism, xenophobia, and ultranationalism, a large part of intellectual elites, Bourdieu's heirs, with the notable exception of those who fill these fables with ambiguous statements and inflammatory speeches. These heirs do not understand what is happening no matter their education, knowledge, and culture. As heirs of this culture, of the codes it has adopted and the languages it speaks, they cannot but feel the powerlessness of this heritage to stop the inexorable rise of an infatuation made of false promises and bad solutions that they know and repeat to no avail, to never have brought anything but a surplus of misfortune and misery to human society. So the following questions: are the elites more inaudible than they were in the past? The authority attached to their knowledge and titles is no longer recognized, if not in a very partial way, by those who solicit their complicit expertise, which is part of what marks their separation from the rest of the population. Is it the people who have turned away from them? Or should it be said, on the contrary, that today the elites are paying for the forgotten and repressed truth of the condition, their own indifference of the misfortune of men? This is the question that leads us today more than ever in Bourdieu's footsteps. I suggest that, guilty of what Bourdieu called an excess of confidence in the powers of discourse, it is because of a lack of timely assessment of their impermeability that these same elites find themselves brutally exposed to increased doubt about the capacity of their work to change the course of the world, even a little. It is for this reason that they show themselves once again powerless to prevent the worst from happening, wherever it is likely to happen, starting with the proliferation of authoritarian regimes with all their impacts on the management of migratory, health, social, environmental, and climatic disasters. Because nothing seems to be able to be stopped, and the discourses come up against the vanity of their effects, it is an understatement to say that this results in the kind of melancholy of history that usually accompanies the disillusionment of the powers of the mind. It would be wrong to reduce it to wounded pride. It would be disregard the nihilism that lies in wait, whose consent to the worst can easily be formulated. What's the point? There is nothing we can do about it. All that can be said and done to analyze, criticize, warn of the evil that is brewing and try to prevent it will not change the course of history, and remains of little weight to counter the seductive power of verbal outrages and extreme measures of the murderous adventurism, actually very organized, of a charismatic leader and his servants who do not care. To abandon oneself to this melancholy, according to which the destiny of the intellectual elite would be to see catastrophes arrive inexorably, without having the slightest chance of avoiding them, is nevertheless to miss the question, which is not so much about the limits and powers of thought as about the conditions of its practice. If we consider our analysis of demophobia and of the reversal of impermeability, this amounts to saying that the analysis of populisms should not focus exclusively on the permeability of heart and mind that they gain from the extreme physis conveyed by their ideologies. but on the impermeability of the elites to the sense of abandonment, distress, helplessness, and misery of those they have cut off themselves from, whom they do not see and do not hear except from afar. This amounts to questioning the resulting complicity, which I will call consent to misery, as I have elsewhere spoken of murderous consent. It is then that the critic of scholarly reason that the Méditation pascalienne, Bourdieu's book, deploy proves decisive. Mocking the pretension of some intellectuals to experience revolutions in the order of words as radical revolutions in the order of things, Bourdieu invites them to pay greater attention to the course of the world and to the more humble intellectual powers, he writes, are never as effective as when they are exercised in the direction of the immanent tendencies of the social order, then unquestionably intensifying by omission or compromise the effects of the forces of the world, which are also expressed through them. First step. Let us stop and think about the gulf that separates the elites, cultivated, educated in prestigious school and university, from this poor, vulnerable, and disillusioned fringe of the population, which at the very least no longer gives them the credit of reason and truth because they don't expect anything good from them. Let us take seriously an observation that is easy to make in Europe, Brazil, the United States, and all over the world. Knowledge and information technologies have long since dethroned all forms of authority that had arrogated to themselves the power to instruct and enlighten, by inviting the vanquished of history to be patient. To understand this fracture, and this is Bourdieu's lesson, we should start afresh from our involvement in the world, inasmuch as it implicitly determines the limits of what we take the trouble to see and hear, the constitution within us of the visible and the invisible, the audible and the inaudible, according to which we decide what revolts us and makes us act because we are determined to reject it. Considering the failings, the bankruptcy, the very injustice of this partiality, we can no longer act as if we were not dependent on a collective history that has produced the categories of thought with which we apprehend the world and society in its fractured diversity. Nor can we act independently of an individual history that has created the conditions of family, society, and school, according to which we have appropriated those same categories of thought, while others were immediately deprived of any possible appropriation of this epistemic order. The meaning and value we give to words in which our perception and apprehension of the world is constructed are themselves dependent of this double history. Against the illusion of a transparency of consciousness to itself, we must admit that this apprehension is more opaque than we are ready to acknowledge, and that being partial in all senses, it is at the same time problematic. This partiality on which I insist is the price to pay for the implicitness that Bourdieu points out. It is because we are involved in the world, he writes, that there is implicitness in what we say and think about it. What is he talking about? Exactly what is implicit. What is implicit? I will argue that the implicit determines and masks everything that may be partisan and therefore truncated, forgetful, and ignorant in our perception and condemnation of violence in the world. That is to say, on our doorstep, in subway corridors, suburbs, and underprivileged countrysides. The implicitness of our condition and of our history thus offers a key to grasping not only the nature and origin, but also the configuration and extent of the consents to misery that define us. Among such forms of consent, I will specifically focus on the consent to misery that not only has little concern for the misfortune of faraway people, but also has little regard or compassion for those nearby. We will not recall the conditions of entry into a scholarly universe that Bourdieu analyzed in detail, except to recall that they remain, even today, the common denominator of all access to a position of power in companies and administrations, as well as in higher education. We will not dwell on the way in which such conditions are constitutive of the habitus shared by those who have this same heritage, whose gradual, progressive, and noticed incorporation has ended up being second nature to them. What will be emphasized, however, is the way in which the resulting scholarly disposition, the conditions of existence that define it, the appropriation of the codes that guarantee it, translate into a withdrawal from the world, a withdrawal from the world. Bourdieu's reflections are a quarter of a century old, and it is not clear that a new analysis of the conditions of existence and the so-called security of those who embark on the scholarly path should not, on the contrary, prompt us to measure how they have deteriorated considerably over the years. The situation of those who aspire to enter the scholarly world, who take the first step, has become noticeably precarious, and economic and social necessities have long since painfully caught up with them. The following quote would thus require some added nuance. If the suspension, I quote, if the suspension of economic and social necessity is what authorizes the emergence of autonomous fields, it is also, says Bourdieu, what, unless special vigilance is exercised, threatens to lock scholarly thought within the limits of ignored or repressed presuppositions, which imply a withdrawal from the world. This suspension does not mean that the scholarly world escapes economic hardship and remains immune to impoverishment, but that it is cut off from the world of production, which is undoubtedly, as Bourdieu points out, a liberating rupture and separation, a disconnection, but contains at the same time the virtuality of a mutilation. Who would deny this today, when all over the world, entire sectors of the economy are weakened by the succession of confinements imposed by the pandemic, thousands of businesses and shops threaten to close, and hundreds of thousands of workers find themselves unemployed. At the same time, it must be admitted that even if the scholarly universe are affected in their operating conditions, in their credits, and in their availability to future generations, they are not directly impacted with regards to the material conditions of existence of those who already belong to them. Let us stop at this withdrawal from the world and at the vigilance it calls for. What is the point of being vigilant so as not to remain withdrawn from the world? I will argue that this withdrawal no longer allows us to pay due attention to the multiple forms of domination that structure and divide society between classes, races, genders, or more generally, to manifestations of violence, forms of social exclusion, deprivation and frustration, because they end up being part of a landscape that we presume to know, disregarding its complexity and diversity. Negligent, forgetful, if not indifferent, we no longer take the trouble to make visible and audible to ourselves the multiple sufferings such withdrawal glosses over. Let's go further. This habituation is essentially due to what I called elsewhere the sedimentation of the unacceptable, the insidious assimilation of ways of saying that justify ways of doing things, ways of speaking about mass unemployment, precariousness, security, foreigners, and so on, become second nature. Fashioned out of those false evidence and abusive oversimplifications which Bourdieu always mistrusted, holding them responsible for our complacent blindness, these ways of speaking draw a screen between us and others. They can become part of the world as a reason for tolerating misfortune. I am very sorry. My text is very, very long. Okay, Zona told me, she awarded me that it will be too long, and maybe I will. Okay, I had many things. Sorry?
Don't hesitate. I would hate to lose on the ending of that beautiful text that I've read. So don't hesitate. We still have enough time.
So what should I do? I continue, or do you want me to stop now?
Go ahead. I
go ahead. Okay. Well, I will ask the same question in 10 minutes. Okay, to know, and just tell me when I have over exaggerated. Okay.
No, we have about 15 minutes to finish, so that's fine. And since it's an inaugural address, there won't be really time for questions. So.
Okay, and is it my English understandable? Do you understand me?
Yes.
No problem. Okay. It's even difficult in English, but it's more difficult through a screen, you know.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay, so to take the, okay, that's I go to the fourth step now. To take the implicit into account is above all to become aware of a privilege which, by definition, has nothing to do with the universal. And it is also to track down the discourses and the ideology which have no other effect than to mask the profound inequalities of access to language, of mastery of codes, of rhetorical skill that such distinctions cover. The result should be a princely humility that Bourdieu recalls in these terms. The awareness of this privilege forbids condemning to inhumanity or barbarism those who are not in a position to fulfill all their human potential because they do not benefit from it. It also forbids to forget the limits that scholarly thought holds to the very special conditions of its emergence, and that must be methodically explored in order to be disposed of. The Western philosophical, end of quote. So, the Western philosophical tradition, as we know, is made up of the valorization of knowledge, contemplation, meditation, ideation, and more generally all forms of thought. From Plato to Heidegger, the West had continuously hierarchized human activities, placing at the top of the scale that form of withdrawal from the world, which is the scholar. Exemplary in this respect is the way in which Hannah Arendt, describing the human conditions, detaches thought from work and labor, making it the highest form of this activity. What humility then commands us to remember is that the possibility of such detachment is far from being universally shared. It never has been. Immersion in the scholastic universe, which has always given access to positions of power in society, inasmuch as they require normative appropriation of symbolic forms, has always presupposed exceptional historical and social conditions. These exceptional conditions are quite something. They have the effect of establishing, as the sociologist points out, I quote, magical border between the elected and the excluded, while at the same time arranging the repression of the differences in conditions that are the conditions of the difference they produced and consecrate. End of quote. Here is the deception, the magical illusion. These conditions have to do with the will to act as if differences in conditions did not exist or had to be explained differently by nature or by merit, imagining that institutions, starting with schools, are sufficient to correct them, and that they give everyone the same chances to join the camp of the elected representatives. It is this repression, this sleight of hand, that makes the conditions of exclusion, which are no longer possible, disappear. This is what is unearthed by the rise of populism that is overwhelming Europe, Latin America, and the United States, but also by the great waves of popular protest that challenge the elites, as the Gilets jaunes movement in France 2018-2019 reminded us. These waves bring the hopes of those who no longer want to be the losers of a history that has forgotten or pretends to forget how much it has excluded them. These masses do not forgive the elected ones for having erased the way in which the historical and social conditions of the election contributed to maintaining the masses' own invisibility and more generally their conditions of non-existence. Fifth step, let us move further in this analysis, in the analysis and determination of these conditions of, that's important, of these conditions of inexistence. They are notably characterized, as we have already mentioned, by the feeling of being invisible, inaudible, of not being heard, let alone listened to. How can this be understood? What determines listening and understanding in a given society? In order to extend our reflections on consent to misery, I will argue that its strongest ally is the economy of linguistic exchange, as Bourdieu suggests in Ce que parler veut dire. Every time we speak, the sociologist reminds us, two causal series come into play to determine our ability to speak and our chances of being heard. The first concerns our linguistic habitus, which is socially shaped by conditions of acquisition that make its use very unequal. This determines our capacity to formulate a differentiated discourse in given circumstances whose singularity, that is to say, its own style, understood as what distinguishes it from others comparable to it, can only be perceived by those who have the appropriate schemes of appreciation. The second is the system of sanctions and specific censorship that structures the language market. Schools, exams and competitions, diplomas, and so on, to whose rituals one must submit if one wants to have any chance for these words to carry value. As a result, in social exchanges exposed to this market, we never have to deal with language, but with discourses that are dependent on this double series. It is in fact because of the variable use of habitus and the structuring of the market that within a differentiated society, not only do different groups not give the same meaning to the same words, but moreover, they do not recognize the same value and do not pay equal attention to all the discourses that may circulate. In such a society, writes Bourdieu, the so-called common names, work, family, mother, love, actually receive different, even antagonistic meanings because members of the same linguistic community use the same language as well as they can, and not several different languages. There are no innocent words, he continues a little further on. Every word, every phrase threatens to take onto antagonistic meanings, depending on the way the sender and the receiver take it. Okay, who will say, end of quote, who will say that this is not the case with the words we invoke to justify our political choices? Liberty, equality, fraternity, solidarity, secularism, and even democracy. Is this the reason for the misunderstanding? Is it because the intellectual, political, media, administrative, socially, and economically dominant elites have long since failed to ask themselves what these words meant in the language of others, that they have made themselves impermeable of the world? Is it because they have not been able to hear those who did not have the same linguistic habitus, but they have lost in return the faculty to be heard themselves when they warn of the worst? Whatever this understanding may be, it follows from the above considerations that language is everything but a universal treasure that all its speakers would share. To reason in these terms is, in effect, to once again overlook both the economic and social conditions that make it possible to acquire what a given society recognizes as legitimate linguistic competence, and the constitution of the linguistic market that organizing the division between a legitimate use of language and its illegitimate use. It also means implicitly subscribing to the different processes that allows the state to impose through institutions, starting with school, administration, a system of norms regulating linguistic practices. It is to deprive oneself of seeing that in a given space, the linguistic market is unified and dominated by a state language, which becomes the theoretical norm against which all linguistic practices are objectively measured. No one, Bourdieu explains, is supposed to be unaware of the linguistic law, which has its own body of jurists, the grammarians, and its own agents of imposition and control, the teachers invested with the power to submit to universal examination and to the legal sanction of school titles, the linguistic performance of speaking subjects. Well, I will cut a little bit to go to my conclusion because it's really long. And I will conclude, if you give me 5 more minutes, with a question. What should we do? Let us start by hearing and listening rather than reconstructing. Encourage people to speak up. Give them the attention and consideration they deserve. Bring them together. Confront them. More than a decade ago, and recently again, I am emphasized the need to rethink the way democracies should go about being more participatory. The injunction I just uttered constitute conditions for not paying lip service to participation. They are certainly not sufficient, but they have a reminder that no one can claim the exorbitant privilege of carrying the word of those who were never allowed to speak up. Our previous reflections dominated by the belief that by ignoring the evils that fracture society, such as material difficulties and existential suffering, one weakens institutions and gets to a political impasse. From this impasse, populism presents itself as a disastrous exit that needs to be countered. How can we free suffering, difficulties, uneasiness, and misfortune from the walls of silence in which they are locked? One last time, we will follow in Bourdieu's footsteps by rereading La misère du monde. At the bottom of the back cover, readers were invited to understand that the book proposed another way of doing politics. What was it about? Without filters, self-serving calculations, or partisan instrumentalizations, the primary task was to learn methodically how to learn suffering from the mouths of those who live it. What was important was to understand by listening these voices the conditions of production of social misery, of which the distant elites trained in the technocratic language of the grandes écoles had only an abstract perception primed by this very language. As Hannah Arendt pointed out, politics exists because of human plurality. It was hopeless to expect that the professionals of politics could give justice to such plurality, as they did not have the means to comprehend it without preconceived judgments. With that form of attention and humility, which is the last thing one learns in these schools. It isn't enough to say that the listened was not heard and that the gulf of misunderstanding have continued to widen. What was urgent, Bourdieu said, was to produce two effects. Firstly, to replace, and I quote, firstly, to replace simplistic and unilateral images, especially those conveyed by the press, with a complex and multiple representation based on the expression of the same realities in different discourses. I quote, abandon the single central dominant, almost divine point of view where the observer and also his reader willingly places himself as long as he does not feel involved in favor of the plurality of perspectives corresponding to the plurality of coexisting and sometimes directly competing points of view. Such was the point of the essential configuration of the space of points of view that made up La Misère du Monde. By giving right to the diversity of lifestyles and to the social interactions that result from them, this wonderful book develops a fine and attentive intelligence of society, which is the first thing to be betrayed by the overly simplistic attempts by the elites to embody the political will and desire of the people. In doing so, Bourdieu understood above all that it is dangerous and inconsequential to talk about misery in overly general terms. Sticking to the great misère de condition as the sole criterion for assessing as an absolute, the suffering of all people meant that one could not see the relative forms of small-scale misery. What Bourdieu calls misère de position, the distinction between great misery and petty miseries, since the misère de position admits a plural, calls for two remarks, and that's my conclusion. The first is that we consider these to be negligible in import. We do not want to see them because they are relative, supposedly subjective, and we consider them to be the necessary trade-off for inequalities that it would be vain to claim to be able to address. They are the ones that make people say, stop complaining. Think of all the adventures you enjoy, of what the state and society do for you. Think about those who are infinitely more unhappy than you are. They constitute the background of the consent to misery, on which our reflections have focused. The second is that nothing yields more favorable ground for the rise of populism than the abandonment of these little miseries to themselves in indifference or contempt. Okay, sorry for having been too long, and it's okay what I wanted to tell you to open this important conference on Bourdieu today. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc, so much. Thank you. This was absolutely fascinating to listen to. I've taken many notes. I would just like to take a few minutes before our next panel to say personally my greatest takeaway. I imagine there are many different ones for all social scientists listening and everybody listening. I think the most important message of why we read Bourdieu today, which was the title of your inaugural address, is this reminder of remaining vigilant from the most nuanced and first levels, such as the importance of language, the access to linguistic expressions and abilities for perfecting the same, and how this leads to a sort of naturalizing of culture, how the vigilantness against the pejorative use of populism as well has, just from a simple use of the word, has led to a sort of legitimization of something that should have been unacceptable, or as Marc Crépon often refers to in his works, the raising of the threshold of toleration. So these are the things us as thinkers, academics, and everyone in general, engaged intellectuals, engaged citizens, should always be vigilant of. Everything starts from the vocabulary we use. And to put it in Bourdieu's context, how even such a thing as a linguistic habitus is everything but natural, is a sort of illegitimate use of language and has a certain agenda of its own. Thank you, Marc, very much for sharing this work with us. And I would just like to remind that this summer, our institute has formed an international academic board, and that Marc Crépon is one of our members. Noam Chomsky is the honorary member. And I will let our director, Gazela Pudar close this inaugural address.
Honorary President, actually. Yes, thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. I think I'm completely following the comment I'm reading here in Zoom. Very interesting introduction. Bourdieu seems to be more actual than ever, facilitation. So I completely agree with that. Thank you also for joining us. I know that you're not feeling well, and I really appreciate that you were able to be with us this 1 hour. I also want to just briefly say in the end that this conference is also very important for us as a, let's say, regional endeavor, having in mind that Bourdieu is not so worked through in our universities in the region as he deserves to be. So I think this conference can give really new impetus to the studies of his work in the future. So thank you all, and Zona, you are taking ahead, and we are continuing with another.
Well, if I just can add something, thank you for your thank you for these words. Of course. Okay, the English translation is not absolutely finished. We have some with, I want to thank Micol Bez. Micol Bez is one of my students. She is also a very good friend of Zona, Zarić. And Micol accepted to translate the text in English because my writing English is not good enough to write it in English. And we have still to work a little bit on the translation. Of course, I will send you the translation, and feel absolutely free to do with the translation of this text what you want. You can also send it. I had no time to present all the text. I had to cut some of that. And of course, this text is yours. And when you will have the English translation, do with it what you want to do. Okay.
Thank you. We really appreciated that. Thanks once more. And you reminded me actually that just to mention that Zona actually translated your book into Serbian here. And this is a book I got recently from her, and I'm really much looking forward to read it. I like the blurb and the title very much. And this is on my reading list now for the holidays. So.
Yes, I'm a very lucky man with my students, as you can see. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. So to continue following, the next panel is at 11:30. And everything until 6 p.m. will be in Serbo-Croatian, and 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. is a roundtable discussion.